For years, as you know, my office has been working to combat the opioid epidemic that has devastated Washington families and overburdened our healthcare system. My team has put in considerable time and resources into this effort. We've initiated investigations, we've filed lawsuits, we've convened summits, we proposed legislation and advocated for reforms at the state and at the federal level. Here's why. Between 1997 and 2011, prescriptions and sales of opioids in Washington skyrocketed more than 500%. To put that in some perspective, in 2011, just give you one data point, 2011, there were enough opioids prescribed in Washington state for every man, woman, and child, so we're including my 11-year-old twins, to have a 16-day supply for every man, woman, and child. As recently as 10 years ago, there were 16 counties in Washington state in which there were more opioid prescriptions that year than there were people. More prescriptions than people, not pills, more prescriptions than people. In 2015, there were still 8 counties where there were more prescriptions than the population. Between 2006 and 2017, in that decade, opioid overdoses killed more than 8,000 Washingtonians. More than were killed by car accidents or firearms. The majority of drug overdose deaths in Washington state involve opioids. The epidemic has strained Washington's healthcare system. Between 2009 and 2014, the rate of opioid-related hospital and clinic stays increased by more than 60% in Washington. And of course, the human toll is staggering. Opioids are devastating families, and my legal team is on the front lines. A 2018 internal survey of the folks in my office, Washington State AAG's Assistant Attorneys General, who handle child abuse and neglect cases all across our state. They're in courtrooms advocating for children when there's an abuse or neglect in the home. We asked them, what role has opioids played? What percentage of cases do opioids play a key role in those cases where there's abuse or neglect? And the legal team came back and said in approximately half of those cases, opioids played a key contributing factor to why a child had to be separated for a period of time or permanently from the home. We're here today to announce the next major step in our effort to hold accountable those who are responsible for this epidemic. This morning, we filed a lawsuit against opioids manufacturer Johnson & Johnson in King County Superior Court. It's not the first lawsuit that we have filed. In 2017, we were one of the first states to file a lawsuit against Purdue Pharmaceutical. In March of last year, we sued the 3 largest distributors of opioids, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen. These are Fortune 15 companies. We have a trial date scheduled for those 3 entities coming up in October of this year. So the team that has joined me today has not only filed this case today, but is also preparing for a trial in October of this year against those 3 entities. Like other companies that sold and distributed opioids, Johnson & Johnson made billions of dollars by fueling Washington's opioid epidemic. Like others, they knowingly deceived doctors and the public about their products' effectiveness in treating long-term pain and the incredible addiction risks of long-term opioid use. But the story of the harm Johnson & Johnson inflicted on Washington state is different in an important way. Johnson & Johnson was also one of the most prolific suppliers of the raw materials used by countless other companies to actually make opioids. Much of the vast expansion of prescription opioids from the industry as a whole can be traced back to Johnson & Johnson. Today I'm joined by State Representative Lauren Davis from the Shoreline area, the 32nd District, who is also the Executive Director of the Washington Recovery Alliance. You'll be hearing from her shortly. We're also joined by Debbie Warfield of Everett, and also by Skagit County Commissioner Lisa Janicki. Both of those women will be speaking as well and sharing a personal perspective of the opioid epidemic and how that's impacted them on a personal level. And I'm also joined by a large number of folks from my legal team who may be assisting me in answering questions as well. So I'll say a few words, then Commissioner Janicki will speak, followed by Representative Lauren Davis, followed by Debbie, and then we'll take your questions. My guess is that when Washingtonians, most Washingtonians, think of Johnson & Johnson, they probably think of baby shampoo. In fact, Johnson & Johnson played a unique role in proliferating opioids in Washington and around the United States. Starting in the 1990s, Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiaries cultivated and processed opium poppy plants and used their raw narcotic materials to manufacture the active ingredients necessary to produce opioid drugs. Johnson & Johnson even developed a poppy plant strain known as the Norman poppy that was high in thebaine, the raw ingredient needed to produce many opioid drugs, including oxycodone. In internal documents, Johnson & Johnson called the Norman poppy, quote, a transformational technology that enabled the growth of oxycodone, end quote. One Johnson & Johnson subsidiary in Tasmania cultivated and processed the opium poppy plants into the necessary narcotic raw materials. Another subsidiary imported them in the United States and then processed the raw materials into the active pharmaceutical ingredients necessary to manufacture opioids. Johnson & Johnson used these ingredients to make its own opioid drugs. In addition, they sold those raw materials to other companies like Purdue Pharmaceutical, and that was a major part of its business. By 2015, Johnson & Johnson was the top United States supplier of the active pharmaceutical ingredients used to make opioid drugs. Johnson & Johnson's raw ingredients went on to become oxycodone, hydrocodone, fentanyl, and others. In addition to its role as a major supplier of the raw ingredients used to make opioids, Johnson & Johnson also deceived doctors and patients about these opioids. Johnson & Johnson aggressively marketed its opioids for chronic pain conditions like headaches and back pain, despite evidence that opioids were not effective at treating these conditions. Johnson & Johnson used both branded marketing and non-branded sources funded by the company to forward its narrative. These non-branded sources included third-party organizations funded by Johnson & Johnson and other manufacturers, like the American Pain Foundation and the American Academy of Pain Management, among others. Those efforts included articles in medical journals and publications funded by Johnson & Johnson, continuing medical education, dinners, seminars, symposiums, conferences, all paid for by Johnson & Johnson and others. The third-party groups also funded lobbying efforts to oppose state-level regulation of opioids, including here in Washington State. For example, the American Pain Foundation provided support to the Washington Pain Alliance to oppose opioid prescription standards here in Washington State. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention determined in 2016 that, in fact, no study exists to show opioids are effective for long-term pain treatment. And the CDC found, quote, extensive evidence that those who use opioids for more than 3 months are at a substantially increased risk of opioid use disorder. Further, other safer options are effective and carry fewer risks, the CDC added. Despite the evidence, Johnson & Johnson claimed there is a very low risk that patients will become addicted to its opioids. For example, Johnson & Johnson marketed one of its opioid painkillers as, quote, a less addictive, milder opioid. At the same time, the FDA-approved label for the drug clearly stated that it had, quote, a high potential for abuse. Like others, Johnson & Johnson even pushed the false narrative of something called pseudo-addiction to persuade doctors that what appeared to be addiction in patients who came back looking for more pills was actually under treatment of their pain. So individuals will come back wanting more opioids, and what Johnson & Johnson said in response to doctors saying, hey, you said this stuff wasn't so addictive, why are these folks back in my office looking for more pills? They coined a term, pseudo-addiction. Those folks aren't really suffering from addiction despite the way it looks. They're actually in pain. And you only get one guess what they recommended those doctors do to treat that pain, more pills. Pseudo-addiction was in fact coined by a doctor who later became an executive at Purdue Pharmaceutical. No study has validated the theory of pseudo-addiction. Here's what we're seeking with this litigation. In addition to civil penalties and damages, we are asking the court to order Johnson & Johnson to give up the profits it made in Washington State as a result of its illegal conduct. Johnson & Johnson has made billions of dollars through its sale of opioids and the raw materials it sold to other companies. We expect Washington's share to at least be in the millions. In November, to put this case in some context, an Oklahoma judge ordered Johnson & Johnson to pay the state $465 million for its role in fueling Oklahoma's opioid epidemic. Our goal is to use the surrendered profits to remediate the effects of the opioid epidemic. The goal, for example, is to fund treatment, education, prevention in communities all across the state. The bottom line is that Johnson & Johnson, like others, must be held accountable for the harm that they've caused to Washington State and to Washington State families. Next, I'm so thankful for all the speakers that we have today. Commissioner Janicki, who I first met, I guess now it's been a while now, several years ago, but I think we were at a conference together, and And afterwards, I think I was speaking a bit about opioids, and afterwards she came up to me and shared her personal perspective of this issue, which has always stayed with me. And I just so much appreciate someone who's an elected official, being willing to talk about the issue from a personal level as well, and the impacts that's had. So, Commissioner, thank you so much for taking time to be here today. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Lisa Janicki. I am a Skagit County Commissioner and also on the Skagit County Board of Health, both roles since 2015. And my perspective of what happened with our son, Patrick is the youngest of 5 children, was 20 years old when he fell during college and broke his back. And the process that started through for 8 years, Patrick was in and out of various doctors' office with a number of prescriptions and kind of a constant flow of pain medication. And I always say I wish I knew then what I know now, but that doesn't really help. When I would question why he was taking medication, and I would pick up a bottle or a package of fentanyl patches. I mean, mind you, fentanyl is, they say, 50 to 100 times more powerful than heroin, but I would always see a prescription label on that. So I didn't question it the way I should have, because in my generation, you trust your family doctor, and you certainly trust and appreciate the access that we as Americans have to health care, including medications. There was a Friday. Patrick's story is different than some, but way too familiar to a lot of parents. So Patrick was a college graduate. He was an Eagle Scout. He was an active Rotarian, and he fought this back pain. He told me in 2016 that, so I'd been on a board of health for over a year, that he was trekking himself into treatment, and that he wanted to get off these medications, and he knew he was addicted to prescription pain pills. And I remember being shocked, thinking I should have known this. There should have been more resources. This should have been easier for him. And he went through treatment. He spent 5 weeks in treatment, and I thought, okay, he's going to be that miraculous 10% that gets through treatment once and is okay. Yeah, there's smiles, because that's not the way it worked out. He had a recovery coach who was a retired physician who was one of his fellow Rotarians, and all the things that should have worked for somebody, and yet it didn't. On a Friday in August of 2017, my husband went to check on Patrick to find out why he hadn't been at work, and Patrick was at the house and had been coughing up blood, and the Mike called 911, and when they came, Patrick walked out to the ambulance. So, but that trip, somewhere in that trip to the hospital, Narcan doesn't work, even administered through an IV, and when Patrick arrived at the hospital, they had been doing chest compressions for almost 20 minutes. Patrick went into a coma and gave us 2 weeks to say goodbye to him, which as a parent, I feel fortunate that I got that time, our family got that time, but it has instilled in me a resolve to bring back to our community the funding, the programs, the people, so that families do not have to go through this. When we're losing our 20 and 30-year-olds, Patrick was 30 when he died, when we are losing our children, we are failing. The medical system, the healthcare system in some ways has failed us. These prescription drugs that have been systematically delivered to the community members, to our friends and family, and have taken this opioid level into every household. If we're honest, every household knows somebody. And not all those people are, not all those addicts, not all those users are someone who is just living on the street. There are people everywhere who are suffering from addiction. And so whatever we can do to help them, to bring those people off the streets into treatment, to help those that are in these office buildings in downtown Seattle who are suffering, that's our job now. And I completely support Attorney General Ferguson's effort at doing this through the legal system. Thank you.
I'm State Representative Lauren Davis from the 32nd Legislative District. My work both inside and outside the legislature primarily centers on behavioral health. Washington's opioid epidemic cannot be told in statistics. It's seen in living rooms across our state where someone's precious child rests in a marble urn upon their mantle. It's seen in the faces of parents who are grieving a child who is still alive. It's seen in the faces of children lost in our child welfare system, without a home and without hope. Opioid use disorder is a disease deeply rooted in brokenness and isolation. 8 years ago, my best friend Ricky was in the throes of opioid addiction. Oxycontin and fentanyl had nearly killed him 3 times that year. Just before Christmas, we were sharing a meal just a few blocks from here. Ricky looked up at me and said, "I don't think I'll ever recover from this." He paused, his voice cracked, and he said, "I don't even think I'm worthy of recovery." Ricky had outlined the 2 primary reasons people don't seek treatment for their addiction: hopelessness and shame. I spent half my career in suicide prevention. After a suicide death, we conduct a mortality review to determine all the factors that contributed to a person's death and to analyze what may have been done to prevent it. I also serve on the healthcare committee in the House, and this year we heard a bill to create a similar maternal mortality review for women who die within 42 days of childbirth. We want to learn what went wrong so we can prevent similar tragedies. We don't conduct death reviews for people who die of opioid addiction. We don't conduct mortality reviews for opioid deaths because there's no uncertainty about what contributed to a person's death, and there is no ambiguity about what could have been done to prevent it. We know that opioid use disorder is a chronic, progressive, fatal brain disease. We also know that when we provide people access to treatment within their window of willingness, they recover. In recent years, the state has made great strides in combating the opioid epidemic. We have enhanced prevention efforts through the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program and regulating physician prescribing practices. We have funded low-barrier clinics where individuals can access medication-assisted treatment, the gold standard for opioid use disorder. We have enhanced collaboration across state agencies in responding to the epidemic, including the Healthcare Authority, the Department of Health, and the Department of Corrections. We've expanded access to the life-saving opioid reversal medication, naloxone. There's one thing in common that almost all people in our state have who have died of an opioid overdose, or who are living homeless in encampments, or who are incarcerated because of their opioid addiction. Almost without exception, they were all, at one point, in recovery. And our system failed them. We failed them. We failed to support them in their recovery. The highest potential return on investment in combating the opioid epidemic is helping people who are in early recovery remain in recovery. Choosing to go to treatment is a great act of valor. We should bring down the moon for these precious ones. But instead, we discharge them from treatment with a backpack full of every problem that ever led them to use, and tell them that they can no longer use the only coping skill they had, drugs. Then we staple criminal records to their backs, crimes of poverty and desperation that render them unable to secure housing and employment. Since the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, nearly all persons in need of substance use disorder treatment in our state have insurance coverage. The problem is that insurance only covers treatment. Insurance does not cover recovery support services, the crucial suite of services that help a person remain in recovery beyond treatment. This includes recovery housing, education and employment support, transportation and child care assistance, places like recovery cafes, and recovery coaching. Our current system is analogous to paying for surgery and then not paying for physical therapy and blaming the surgery for not working. People don't fail treatment. Treatment fails people. Insurance also does not cover pre-treatment services, including crucial outreach and engagement services to individuals who are living in homeless encampments and who are incarcerated, to build that trust and build bridges to hope and recovery. We are indebted to the Attorney General's office and the leadership of this incredible team on combating the opioid epidemic. The funding that will come to our state as a result of these legal actions will be flexible, unrestricted dollars. And that means we will finally be able to fund what we've always known works and been unable to deliver: comprehensive pre-treatment, treatment, and recovery support services, treatment within people's window of willingness. And we will finally be able to bring down the moon for these precious ones and love them back to life. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Debbie Warfield, and I'd like to share with you my personal experience with the opioid epidemic and how it has changed my family's life forever. Our son Spencer was born in 1988. He was a big guy with lots of energy who loved his family and friends. He grew up across the street from his beloved grandparents and enjoyed playing in the neighborhood with friends and cousins. I felt he had an ideal childhood. He started showing signs of depression and ADHD in middle school, but he remained involved in sports, friends, and his honors classes. We were concerned, but thought it was just a teenage stage. We had him see a counselor and a psychiatrist, where he was prescribed Adderall for his ADHD and Xanax for his anxiety. The only other experience he had had with a prescription drug was when he was 5 years old. He had dislocated his elbow rollerblading and was given Vicodin for pain. Years later, he would look back and remember how good that Vicodin had made him feel, even at such a young age. Spencer was 6'5" and a natural athlete. He played football and suffered a shoulder injury in high school, which he was prescribed OxyContin for. This started a downward spiral for Spencer. He ended up having 2 major surgeries while in college. Both surgeries, he was prescribed opiates for pain. Spencer had to withdraw from school because of his last surgery. I recently found a letter he had written to the college in the spring of 2011 for his reinstatement. Quote, "In the fall of 2010, I severely damaged my ankle in an accident that left me on crutches for 3 months. During this time, I was prescribed heavy amounts of painkillers and anti-anxiety medications to deal with the pain of this injury. These heavy amounts of narcotics led to depression and anxiety that ultimately made me become reliant on these medications. I became resistant to them, and therefore the dosages were increased, which led to severe mental consequences that led me to become addicted to these harmful narcotics. I checked myself into a drug rehab center for 30 days to solve this severe problem." End quote. We thought treatment would be a one-time cure for him, but this was only the beginning. His substance use with prescription drugs moved him to heroin. It was so heartbreaking to know he was struggling on many levels, and we did not know how to help. There were many emergency room visits, mental health evaluations, treatment facilities, and a lot of love and support to try to fix him and keep him alive. At the time Spencer was struggling, the only help we were offered by those working in the treatment profession was to put him out on the streets with no emotional or financial support if he was using. This was something we were not willing to do. The medical community offered no solutions. They would release him from the hospital after 2 overdoses into our care, saying if he continued to use, he would be dead. After Spencer's passing in October of 2012, at the age of 24, from a heroin overdose, we kept the details of his death just within our family. There was a lot of guilt, shame, and what ifs, along with not wanting to expose ourselves or Spencer's memory to this nightmare that we had lived. The effects of this epidemic will be with us for generations to come. It is so important to hold the manufacturer and distributors of prescription opioids accountable for their unlawful practices. The lawsuits brought by the Attorney General's Office of the State of Washington will allow necessary resources to be available for science-based treatment, mental health counseling, support with school-age children, just to name a few. Many young children are facing trauma that needs to be properly dealt with. Some children are exposed to drugs at birth or grow up around a parent or family member using and later go on to use themselves. We need to provide support to our education system so that we can help individuals receive the tools they need to live stable and healthy lives as they grow up. Also, family members need resources to deal with the grief of their loss. 500,000 Americans have been lost to this disease in the last decade. Our family will never be the same, and as a mother, I will always feel like I could have done more to save Spencer. I will live with that the rest of my life. But I know there's a lot still to be done, and I will continue to help this community by sharing his story. Thanks.
So just before we take questions, I want to thank all 3 of our speakers. Representative Davis has been a real leader on this work and has been really a breath of fresh air in the state legislature since she's come in relatively recently still on her, her real focus on these issues. So I just appreciate all the work you're doing and being here. And Commissioner Debbie, thanks for sharing your stories about your sons, which, public speaking isn't easy in any circumstance, but to share a story like that, and honestly, more than some guy in a tie, hearing those stories, what the case is all about, right? And it'll be the job of our legal team to communicate that to our judge, in this case and the others, right? That behind the legal arguments that we have and all the facts and the statistics, I mentioned statistics at the beginning, statistics can be numbing in a way, right? The numbers are so high, it can be overwhelming in a way, and that's why it's so important to hear your stories about the actual individuals who are impacted by what's going on. I can't begin to tell you how many individuals I've met with who have lost their sons and daughters to this epidemic, or their children may still be alive, but they've really lost the child that they knew, right, because of that addiction. So I thank you both for your words. So with that, we will take any questions that you have, and we'll do our best. We think there might be folks on the phone, I think, so we'll do our best to, if speakers come back up, to reintroduce ourselves so those on the phone know who's speaking. So we'll start with folks here in the room, and then we'll turn to folks on the phone. Yes, go right ahead.
Did the Oklahoma ruling come into play for you deciding to bring this lawsuit?
So I'll repeat the question for folks on the phone. The question is, the Oklahoma lawsuit, did that come into play for filing this lawsuit? I guess, not especially, no. What I would say is, just to broaden that out a little bit, it's obviously been a bipartisan effort of attorneys general across the country, and many local jurisdictions and tribes have brought litigation, as you know. And so we know we're part of a larger effort and have communication with those other states and those jurisdictions and those tribes, obviously. So we're very much aware of what's going on. That said, for me in making a decision about filing a lawsuit, which is a significant investment of resources, of people and time in my office, I need to balance out the resources we have with focusing on the entities that I think are most responsible for fueling the epidemic, and to make sure that we have good cases that we can prosecute all the way to trial. And so just what I would say at a high level is that there's been a lot of litigation from a lot of different jurisdictions. There are relatively few jurisdictions that are actively litigating those cases, right? Moving forward, prosecuting those cases, getting documents, moving forward. The Purdue case, for example, we were set to be in trial, I think like literally right now if they hadn't declared bankruptcy. The case I mentioned we have set for trial in October against those three entities. Our philosophy is if we're filing, we're moving towards trial. That's our approach. And so it's a big investment to make that decision because, as you might imagine, an entity like Johnson & Johnson has a lot of resources to defend itself, and so it's a big investment. So we're aware of other states and other jurisdictions. We appreciate what they're doing. But no, each decision is kind of on our own of what we think is the right case to bring after a lot of conversation and investigation by the team.
Do you expect to file any more?
I was just chatting with my team this morning about that question, which I knew would come, so I appreciate it. As you know, we don't talk about any investigations we might have. That's just our philosophy we have across the board for any of the affirmative work that we do. That's just our approach. So we don't talk about investigations. We make announcements once we have a lawsuit to file or a resolution to announce. So I can't answer it specifically. What I can say is, and I've been asked, how about this? I've been asked that same question at previous press conferences on previous litigation, and obviously we've had these things in the works, right? So what I would say is that I think I started by saying that combating the opioid epidemic and making sure those most responsible for it are held accountable is a primary focus of our office. That's not changing. And would I be surprised if this was the last lawsuit we filed related to this issue? Yes. But back to the earlier question, look, it's a big step to file one of these, particularly because my philosophy is we're not just filing a file and then join on some big settlement down the road. No, we're filing because we want to litigate. That's what we're doing. That's what we're in it for.
Washington State is solo on all of the other, the three now lawsuits.
So that lawsuit is filed here in Washington State, in King County Superior Court, right? In King County Superior Court. Trial set for October, I think I said earlier. Is that right? Against the distributors. And so now other jurisdictions have filed similar lawsuits. There would not be many, if you're curious, we could chat afterwards about how many trial dates are before ours. There would not be many. And I wouldn't be surprised if our litigation is the next one to go to trial against those distributors. Yeah. Yes?
So you're filing it's in state court, so what law are you using?
Sure. So the question for those on the phone, I think Martha might be taking this from my team. It's our aspects of the legal bases around the litigation. So primarily a nuisance claim, but I'll ask Martha to flesh that out just a little bit, and we're happy to give more information afterwards as well. Martha, if you don't mind introducing yourself as well.
Hello, my name is Martha Rodriguez-Lopez, and I'm part of the team that's bringing this lawsuit. To answer your question, we have 3 legal causes of action, one based on the Consumer Protection Act, another based on the concept of nuisance, and the third based on negligence. They're similar to the claims that we've brought before in distributors in Purdue. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
And what I'll do is turn to folks on the phone, then I'll come back for one last round here if folks have questions. So I know it's always tricky on the phone. It's easy to speak over one another, but if anyone has a question on the phone, if you don't mind just introducing yourself and who you're with, and then we'll be happy to take your question.
I have a question. This is Joel Conley, SeattlePI.com. To another case that you filed, the Purdue case. We've recently seen a settlement offer in which the Sackler family was offering to put up $3 billion, along with news of the billions of dollars that the Sacklers have taken out of the company over the last few years as their legal problems have increased. What is Washington's position on their offer, and who are Washington's allies in that position?
Thanks, Joel, for that question. I think I heard another voice trying to jump in, so after I answer Joel's question, whoever else is jumping in will go to you next. So Joel, on that settlement discussion that's been reported in the news a fair amount, I think you asked what my position is on that. Maybe 3-word answer, not good enough would be the short answer. The slightly longer answer, and it gets complicated in a hurry, but I'll try and keep it relatively short, Joel, is look, the Sackler families, I think you mentioned, made billions. They've moved billions overseas. Without getting the details of the conversation around a possible settlement, a couple things struck me about it in terms of reaching a decision not to move forward with further discussions along those lines. One, the settlement involved no accountability for the Sacklers in terms of taking responsibility for the harm that they caused. Didn't require them to take responsibility. Frankly, Joel, it didn't require them to say, you know what, we feel really bad about what happened out there in Washington State. They didn't have to say that. And that's just not good enough. In addition, the amount of money, different dollar amounts were reported in the press. I won't go into the details of those discussions, which, at least for myself, I keep confidential. But some have been reported. You know, what I would say is that the dollar amount simply wasn't enough from my standpoint. I think you also asked maybe, Joel, kind of where different AGs were on that. I'll only say to what I think has been reported, and I think it's fair to say, and I think it's been reported, that there was a bit of a split between AGs on whether or not to pursue further conversations along the lines that were roughly articulated for a possible settlement. Those who wanted to pursue that and those who, like me, did not think it was good enough. Very roughly speaking, that split was, you know, kind of split in half, would be a very rough outline of that. So, again, Joel, it's a really complicated issue. I'm oversimplifying the extreme, but I guess one thing maybe I would add to that is that sometimes I say this here in the office, that in making a decision on really big decisions like these cases, and I might add that of all the complex litigation that my team's been involved in, so I've been Attorney General, I might put all the opioids litigation as amongst the most complex and challenging because of the tremendous harm that's been caused, as you've heard today, and the outrageous conduct by very powerful corporations. And things get complex in a hurry in trying to decide what would be a good resolution. What I would say is that the more complex a decision can be, sometimes my philosophy is to simplify it. And for me, the stories you heard today are stories I've heard across the state, and those motivate me and my team to in part have resources, as you heard from speakers like Representative Davis and others, to have resources to help people in our state. That's critically important. What I would also say is I've had a lot of people come up to me who've been personally impacted by the epidemic to say, that money's important, Bob, and I want that, but they often will say, hey, you know what I also want? I want to be able to walk into a courthouse in downtown Seattle and watch employees of these companies testify about what they knew and when they knew it and why they continued doing it, despite the harm that they were causing, that they knew they were causing, all in the name of profits. I want that. So no guarantees that any one of these cases will go to trial. What I'll say is that Purdue case, we'd be in trial right now if they had declared bankruptcy. That's where we were going. And that's a motivator for us as well. So that was also a reason why I declined to move forward on settlement talks. Joel, was the feeling that we were ready for trial, wanted to move forward to trial, and want to have that accountability. So folks like Debbie and Commissioner Janicki could walk into a courtroom and see the employees of, in that case, Purdue Pharmaceutical, speak to what they did. Sorry for the long answer there, but that was an important question. Someone else, I think, had a question?
Hi, this is Sarah Randazzo. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Beyond Purdue, I was wondering if the state has also been engaged at all in the multi-state settlement talks that have been reported involving the three big distributors and Johnson & Johnson. I didn't know if the filing of this lawsuit meant that you guys weren't interested in those broader settlements that would include Johnson & Johnson.
Thanks for that question. I try not to get too much involved in specifics on settlement negotiations, for obvious reasons. I guess I would first refer you back to my answer to Joel's question about just my philosophy on these cases and when I file them, what I'm hoping to achieve from them. I guess the only thing I would add to that is that by filing, I don't rule out a settlement down the road by any stretch of the imagination. So I would not want the lawsuit to be interpreted that I'm saying, hey, I would never agree to a settlement with Johnson & Johnson, for example. That said, look, I think some cases need to be tried. but I spoke about accountability. That's important, and so not ruling anything out or necessarily, but my team knows that if we're filing with the expectation that we are litigating this case, right? We're not filing and just setting it aside. You see that from a lot of jurisdictions. That's not a criticism. We're filing and we're litigating, and that's the approach we're taking. If there's a resolution I think addresses what you heard from other speakers here about, hey, the resources we need, I'm acutely aware of those resources, and I have to balance out the need for those dollars with the importance of accountability for these companies and having a day in court in which they're held accountable, and I need to balance it out and make the appropriate decision at the right time. Any other questions from those on the phone?
This is Jim Giamson from the Spokesman Review.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
When you look at Johnson & Johnson's role in the opioid epidemic and what the state needs in resources, what would you say would be a fair amount to come from Johnson & Johnson compared to some of the other suppliers and manufacturers?
Jim, I know a trick question when I hear it. So I'm a couple things. I mean, one is, look, we just filed. We'll be going through an extensive discovery process of getting more documents and, frankly, learning more. We know a lot, but we think we'll know more. So it truly is premature to put a dollar amount out there right now. I wish I'd give you a better answer as things go forward. I think I might, maybe I'll be able to give you a better answer, but this is not a small case. I'm not sure how to put it other than in making a decision about what's an appropriate dollar amount. I'll be thinking about what you heard today from the speakers about the impacts of the opioid epidemic on their families and their lives, and that'll be at the front of my mind. And just at the risk of repeating myself, the importance of accountability for these companies. Writing a check is very important to help prevent other sons and daughters from going through what you heard today. It's critically important. I can't overstate that enough. But we're prepared to litigate, and we're filing with that in mind, but open to a resolution as time goes forward. Any other questions from those on the phone? If not, we'll come back to see if there's any last questions here, and then we'll wrap up. Any last questions in here?
Question for
Yeah.
the two moms here.
Yes.
Speak to this or both of you.
Yes.
If we we're so drastically underserved as far as treatment and resources, had there been this more resources and more treatment available at the time you can get saved your future?
Commissioner, you want to go first? You mind repeating the question for those on the phone? Would be great if you want to answer the question.
So this is Lisa Janicki, and the question was whether more resources at the time of Patrick going through treatment and recovery would have helped. And I don't know that it would have helped my son. He had medical insurance, so he got to go into treatment facilities. He came back and had a recovery coach. He was going to meetings 3 times a week. But yet what his story really opened up was how many people didn't have access. They didn't have the right kind of insurance that they could actually get into a recovery or a treatment facility. They didn't, parents and friends and coworkers didn't know enough. There's an education piece to this, that they didn't know enough to ask the questions and to be supportive. When someone's going through cancer, we ask them how treatment's going, and we're empathetic and sympathetic, and but if someone's going through treatment for addiction, nobody talks about that. And nobody asks how your child is doing, and or how you are doing, or how your spouse is doing. There's a bit of the taboo. So the public education part of this is really important. The actual facilities are important. Patrick had to go way out of area. Community-based resources would have been a lot more convenient, and would have helped put that supportive. But there is definitely an access issue for Patrick in particular. Maybe not, but for so many people I see suffering in our community, absolutely we need more resources at all different levels. Debbie, do you?
This is Debbie Warfield. Yeah, I feel like Spencer had insurance, but it really didn't help him. There was no better treatment for him than someone without insurance. The treatment centers that we went to, your basic 28-day treatment, were not effective for him. It was 28 days that he was able to detox and be in a safe place, but to me, those things really need to change. We need to look at that differently. That is not the answer, and so I think I just want to really target on that. Not sure we have found the correct treatment yet. And I would like to see the medical schools really taking this on and, really looking at addiction. It's been around for, as long as mankind. So it's time to really, really find the answer. Thank you.
One last question, then we'll be available afterwards for one-on-one.
At the beginning of the press conference, you said in the lawsuit, they'll be asking Johnson & Johnson to pay back what they paid in Washington
Yeah.
State. Do you know what that number is?
I'll ask the team if we have a dollar amount. Or Martha, do you want to just maybe, if you,
Sure.
to the extent you can, yeah.
Sure. We actually do not have a precise dollar amount yet. Of course, that's subject to additional discovery related to the different drugs that Johnson & Johnson sold here in Washington. But we're confident that we're talking about millions of dollars over the relevant time period.
And quick follow-up,
yeah.
is the state prepared to spend that, like you said, on treatment and prevention, or does the legislature and local public health districts need to kind of get in line and figure out how they're going to spend that that's most effective?
Yeah, what I'd say is if there's a kind of a long answer to which I won't in the interest of time go into, but I'll say is that my goal with this lawsuit and all the lawsuits we have filed and any future lawsuits we may file on this issue, my goal on the financial side, right, so I've talked about the accountability side, right, but on the financial side, what you're getting at, my goal is that any dollars that we recover through a settlement or through a successful trial, that those dollars go exclusively, right, to address the opioid epidemic. Now, the specifics of how that's done, look, we need to work out when the time comes, right? But the goal is, and Representative Davis supports this, right? The goal is not to write a check to the legislature for millions of dollars to be used in the general fund for all sorts of general good projects addressing the state. No, it's to address the opioid epidemic. And a lot of the ideas you heard today were the kinds of things that we'd be interested in focusing on. That's the objective here. So it would not be like the tobacco litigation where the state recovered large sums of money, but very few of those dollars went to actually addressing, right, the problem that the lawsuit was focused on. I think we've learned from that experience, and so I'd be doing everything in my power to structure any resolution in a way that makes sure the dollars go to address the opioid epidemic. The specific way in which that's done would take time to flesh out when the time is right. Thank you so much for being here. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for those on the line, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.